Crassostrea is a genus of true oysters, family Ostreidae, containing some of the most important oysters used for food. Some species in the genus have been moved to the genus Magallana. Species. Extant species. Extant species include Crassostrea equatorialis, D'Aubigny 1846. Crassostrea angulata, Lamarck 1819, Portuguese oyster. Crassostrea brasiliana, Lamarck 1819. Crassostrea chilensis, Filippi 1845. Crassostrea columbiensis, Handley 1846. Crassostrea curtesiensis, Hertlein 1951. Crassostrea cuttacensis, Newton and Smith, 1912. Crassostrea dianbaensis, Xia, Wu, Xiao, Nu, 2014. Crassostrea rhizophori, Gilding 1828. Crassostrea siccamia, Amamiya 1928, Kumamoto oyster. Crassostrea tulipa, Lamarck 1819, mangrove oyster. Crassostrea virginica, Gmelin 1791, eastern oyster. Fossil species. Crassostrea alabamiensis, Lee 1833. Crassostrea ashley, Hertlein 1943, Sin. Ostrea arnoldi. Crassostrea cahobacensis, Pillsbury and Brown 1910. Crassostrea contracta, Conrad 1865. Crassostrea cucullaris, Lamarck 1819. Crassostrea quibana, Yun 1974. Crassostrea elegans, Desches, 1832, Sin. Cubatostrea elegans Desches 1832 or Crassostrea, Cubatostrea, elegans. Crassostrea gigantissima, Finch 1824, giant fossil oyster. Crassostrea gryphoides, Schlotheim 1813. Crassostrea hedgeri, Hearing 1899. Crassostrea ingens, Zittel 1864. Crassostrea kawaujadensis, Tamura 1977. Crassostrea patagonica, D'Aubigny 1842, Sin. Ostrea ferrarisi. Crassostrea raincourti, Desches 1858. Crassostrea titan, Conrad 1853, Sin. Ostrea prior, O. Andersoni. Crassostrea transitoria, Hupe 1854, Sin. Ostrea maxima. Crassostrea wyominghensis. Genetics. The genome of Crassostrea gigas, now Magallana gigas, has been recently sequenced, revealing an extensive set of genes that enable it to cope with environmental stresses. References: Crassostrea on Britannica.com.